story begins in the autumn of 1917 in the quiet valleys of Oregon, when the United States was already drawn into the turbulence of the First World War. Towns that once felt remote and untouched by history suddenly found themselves changed by scarcity, suspicion, and the strange pulse of wartime life. Amidst this atmosphere, travelers came and went, looking for lodging along the winding roads that connected Portland with smaller, half-forgotten settlements. And in one such town stood a hotel that seemed unremarkable at first glance. 3 stories of weathered timber, the paint faded from years of wind and rain, its sign creaking above the entrance. The hotel had a reputation, not for grandeur, but for warmth. It was said that the proprietor, a man in his late 50s with a carefully combed mustache and a slow, deliberate manner, always welcomed guests with a bottle of wine. It was his ritual, his way of giving weary travelers something more than a bed for the night. In a time when luxuries were scarce, the simple gesture of sharing wine by the fire gave his establishment a small but genuine charm. Guests would remember the way the glass reflected the amber light of kerosene lamps, and how laughter softened the chill of Oregon's misty evenings. But there were whispers, too, stories shared in hushed tones on train rides or over letters passed between friends. Some said that people left the hotel looking pale, with eyes heavy and stomachs unsettled. Others swore that the wine had a strange aftertaste, metallic, almost medicinal. In 1917, few took these warnings seriously. Illness was common, food spoiled quickly, and not every glass poured in America's rural corners was of reliable quality. Yet the pattern lingered, unexplained, and as the weeks turned into months, the small hotel in Oregon acquired a quiet reputation, a place that offered comfort, but also carried a shadow. One guest, a traveling salesman named Robert Haynes, recorded in his notebook that the wine had left him uneasy. He wrote of a bitterness beneath the sweetness, something that clung to the throat long after the glass was set down. Another, a schoolteacher on her way to visit relatives, described waking in the middle of the night with a burning fever, her dreams twisted and violent as though the wine itself had unlocked something inside her. Most recovered, though none could ever quite forget the taste. And a few, just a few, never left the hotel at all. Imagine the scene on a typical evening. Rain pattering softly against the windows, the lamps glowing with their dim halos, the proprietor pouring deep red liquid into glass after glass. Guests raised their cups, grateful for company in a lonely time, unaware that the very drink meant to soothe their spirits might hold the seeds of something fatal. They drank slowly, the sound of the clock echoing in the lobby, the faint strains of a gramophone playing an old tune in the corner. The fire crackled, boots dried by the hearth, and laughter mingled with the quiet Oregon night. To anyone passing outside, it looked safe, almost idyllic. Yet inside, the line between comfort and danger blurred with every sip. What made the ritual so haunting was not just the act of drinking, but the trust it represented. In 1917, hotels were not just businesses, they were sanctuaries, places where strangers placed their safety in the hands of an innkeeper. To share wine was to share humanity, a fragile thread in a time when the world itself seemed on the verge of collapse. And so no one asked too many questions. No one suspected that the glass handed to them might contain more than fermented grapes. The hotel still stood silent in the years that followed, long after the war ended. But the stories of poisoned wine did not vanish. They spread in fragments, a coroner's uncertain notes, a priest's sermon about temptation, a column buried deep in a local newspaper. None of it ever came together in a single account, and perhaps that is what made it all the more unsettling. There was no trial, no headline, no resolution, only silence, the kind that lingers in empty hallways when footsteps have long since faded. As you listen tonight, I invite you to walk back into that lobby with me. Feel the damp chill of the Oregon rain clinging to your coat. Hear the murmur of voices around the fire. See the glimmer of wine swirling in the glass you've been offered. You do not know the other guests, and you cannot read the mind of the man pouring your drink. But you can sense it, the unease, the quiet suggestion that something is not quite right. It is not the fire that warms you, but the heat of a liquid sliding down your throat, carrying with it the possibility of sleep. Or something darker. This is not the story of a haunted house or a ghostly apparition. It is the story of trust, betrayal, and the thin line between hospitality and horror. It is the story of a hotel in Oregon in the year 1917 where guests arrived weary and hopeful, and where some, after raising their glasses, never walked back into the night again. 2. Ladar Sejarah. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was a country in transition. By 1917, the nation had entered the First World War, and the ripples of that conflict touched even the most remote towns in Oregon. Railroads stitched together landscapes that once felt impossibly vast, and hotels, modest, family-run establishments more than glittering urban towers, served as waypoints for merchants, teachers, farmers, and the occasional drifter. To understand the story of the poisoned wine, we must first step back and look at the world these guests inhabited, the culture that shaped their journeys, and the fragile trust that held strangers together in a nation marked by upheaval. Life in rural Oregon during this period was both demanding and intimate. Logging camps filled the forests, their workers hardened by long hours and uncertain wages. Farmers tended fields with stubborn determination, producing wheat, hops, and fruit that supplied the growing cities. The Willamette Valley, with its rolling hills and mist-covered mornings, provided abundance, yet life remained precarious. Illness could spread quickly in isolated towns, supplies were often delayed, and most families lived only a season or two away from hardship. In this setting, hospitality was not just courtesy, it was survival. Travelers depended on inns and hotels not only for shelter but for food that was safe, for beds that were clean, and for company that eased the loneliness of long roads. American society at the time was also marked by profound shifts. Prohibitionist movements had been gathering strength since the late 19th century, arguing that alcohol was a poison in itself, destroying families and weakening the moral fiber of communities. By 1917, the 18th Amendment was only a few years away, and debates about drink ran through church sermons, political speeches, and newspaper columns. To serve wine in this climate was already a statement, an insistence on tradition, or perhaps a subtle act of resistance against the tide of temperance. Guests who accepted a glass were not only receiving refreshment, but also participating in a cultural tension, one that gave even ordinary evenings an undertone of defiance. At the same time, science and medicine were advancing but still limited in reach. Germ theory had become widely accepted, and laboratories were beginning to analyze toxins with more precision. Yet in small Oregon towns, doctors still relied heavily on observation, anecdote, and remedies passed down through generations. If someone fell ill after drinking a glass of wine, explanations varied. Spoiled grapes, contaminated casks, or perhaps simple indigestion. Poison, deliberate or accidental, was not easily confirmed, and suspicion often lingered without resolution. In an era before widespread forensic testing, mystery could thrive in the gaps left by uncertain science. The war itself added to the atmosphere of unease. News from Europe arrived daily, filled with stories of gas attacks, secret plots, and soldiers dying in distant trenches. The idea of unseen danger became part of the American imagination. When whispers spread about poisoned wine in a rural hotel, they resonated with this broader cultural fear. That harm could be hidden, waiting quietly in something as ordinary as a meal or a drink. It was not just a matter of local gossip, but part of a national mood, one that blurred the line between rumor and reality. Culturally, Oregon in 1917 was a mosaic. Immigrants from Scandinavia, Germany, and Eastern Europe had settled in farming communities, bringing their languages, recipes, and traditions. Native tribes, long displaced by waves of settlers, still carried memories of broken treaties and eroded lands. The clash of these histories created both tension and exchange. Sharing food and drink was one way to bridge differences, but it also carried risks of misunderstanding. A glass of wine, offered with generosity by an innkeeper of European descent, might symbolize old-world hospitality, but to others it could carry suspicion, especially in a time when anti-immigrant sentiment grew sharper under wartime suspicion. German Americans in particular faced scrutiny, accused of harboring loyalties to the enemy. A foreign accent behind the counter, a peculiar taste in the glass, these details could ignite stories that spread faster than facts. Even the architecture of the hotel itself reflected the culture of the era. Built of wood rather than stone, it was vulnerable to fire, storms, and time. Its creaking floors and narrow hallways spoke to practicality, not luxury. Guests expected modest comforts, a clean bed, a hearty meal, and perhaps the small pleasure of wine by the hearth. The ritual of drinking together carried a symbolic weight. It dissolved distance between strangers, affirmed the humanity of those far from home. When poison entered this ritual, if poison truly did, it was more than an act of violence. It was a betrayal of culture, a rupture in the trust that bound travelers to hosts in an uncertain world. The press of the time, especially in Oregon, thrived on sensationalism. Newspapers often embellished stories of crime, mystery, and scandal to capture readers' attention. Reports of poisoned wine, if they appeared at all, would have been framed in language designed to provoke both fear and fascination. Yet many such accounts were buried in local columns, overshadowed by the daily toll of war and political upheaval. For a scandal to survive in memory, it had to cling to something universal. And what could be more universal than the act of drinking together, of trusting that what was poured into your glass would not harm you? Religion, too, shaped interpretation. Pastors preached that the devil's temptations often came disguised in pleasures of the flesh: music, gambling, alcohol. To many congregations, stories of poisoned wine sounded less like crime and more like parable, a warning that indulgence itself could be fatal. Communities often turned inward, framing tragedy not through law or science, but through the lens of sin and morality. This blending of faith, rumor, and fear made the story of the Oregon Hotel linger long after it should have been forgotten. Thus, when we speak of the poisoned wine of 1917, we are not only describing a possible crime in a small wooden hotel, we are speaking of a society in flux, caught between tradition and reform, faith and science, trust and suspicion. We are looking at a culture where the simple act of raising a glass carried the weight of history, where every sip could be an act of defiance, devotion, or perhaps fatal mistake. The hotel in Oregon was not grand, not the sort of place where politicians or businessmen gathered. It was smaller, quieter, but in that quietness lay its strange appeal. Guests would arrive tired from the road, stepping off horse-drawn wagons or emerging from early automobiles that coughed smoke into the damp evening air. They would sign their names in the ledger, leave their hats on hooks by the door, and follow the innkeeper to the hearth where the ritual awaited them. The uncorking of the bottle, the steady pour of red liquid, the raising of glasses. The first incident remembered in local accounts involved a miner from southern Oregon. He had traveled north seeking work, his hands still blackened with traces of coal. He drank heavily that night, laughing too loudly at the stories of fellow guests, until suddenly he grew pale. His laughter cut short, his breath staggered, and he clutched his stomach as though a knife had twisted within him. The others thought it was drunkenness, nothing more. They laid him in his bed where he groaned until dawn, his body trembling. By morning he was gone. The official explanation was exhaustion, perhaps influenza, but those who had shared his company whispered of the wine's unusual sharpness, a bitterness that lingered after every swallow. A week later, a seamstress from Portland, traveling to visit relatives, wrote in her diary of her night at the hotel. She described the fire's glow, the soft ticking of the clock in the lobby, and the glass of wine pressed into her hand by the innkeeper himself. At first it warmed her, easing the ache of the journey. But as midnight approached, her head grew heavy, her thoughts disjointed. She awoke in darkness, her body drenched in sweat, her heart racing as though she had been chased through her dreams. She survived, leaving the next morning pale and shaken, her diary marking the experience with unease. The diary was later found by her family, a testament to a night she could not fully explain. Then came the traveling salesman, Robert Haynes, whose notes became one of the few surviving first-hand records of the strange pattern. He wrote of how the innkeeper insisted on pouring a second glass, smiling politely though his eyes seemed distracted. Haynes described the way the wine clung to his throat, metallic, as though laced with something that did not belong. He forced himself to finish only half, setting the glass aside while the others drank. In the middle of the night, he was roused by the sound of retching in the hallway. Another guest doubled over in agony. Haynes would leave the hotel at dawn, vowing never to return. His notes preserved in a small leather book, discovered decades later in an attic. Each incident built upon the last, a chain of unease that tightened with every retelling. The victims varied: a farmer seeking to sell his crops, a teacher on her way to a new post, a soldier returning home on leave. The pattern remained the same: an evening of warmth and laughter, the sharing of wine, and then the sudden descent into illness, burning throats, twisting stomachs, fevered dreams. Some survived, weakened but alive. Others faded quickly, their bodies carried from the hotel in hushed silence. The reactions of the other guests were marked by fear and confusion. Some blamed spoiled casks, insisting the wine had turned. Others muttered darker theories: deliberate poisoning, an innkeeper hiding secrets behind his carefully combed mustache. Yet no one confronted him directly. In those years, authority was fragile, suspicion dangerous, and most travelers preferred to leave quietly, never to return, rather than risk becoming entangled in something they could not name. One account tells of a young couple who arrived one winter's night, their breath visible in the cold air. They were newly married, their carriage wheels thick with mud from the frozen road. They too were offered wine, and though the husband drank eagerly, the wife declined, citing fatigue. By morning, the husband lay cold and still, while the wife wept silently, her refusal of the glass the only reason she lived to tell the story. Her words spread quickly, repeated by neighbors and strangers alike, until they became part of the region's whispered folklore. The horror lay not in spectacle, but in silence. Guests did not scream into the night or fall dead at the table. They slipped quietly into sickness, their bodies betraying them in the darkness of rented rooms. To those around them, it seemed almost spectral, as if the hotel itself exhaled some hidden curse. And still, travelers came, drawn by the necessity of the road, the inevitability of shelter. They drank because refusing would have been rude, even insulting. In a culture where hospitality was sacred, the knife, the axe, the sting of unseen poison. All these images haunted the imaginations of those who tried to make sense of the events. Some claimed to see figures in the hallway at night, guests who should not have been there, pale faces lit by moonlight. Others spoke of dreams filled with fire, of visions of being buried alive, of shadows pressing against their chests until they woke gasping for air. Whether these were the effects of poison or of fear itself, no one could say with certainty. By the spring of 1918, the hotel's reputation was undeniable. Families avoided it, wagons passed it by, and whispers followed the innkeeper wherever he went. Yet still, no law intervened, no sheriff closed its doors. In the confusion of wartime, in the absence of clear evidence, the truth remained elusive. Was it deliberate malice? Was it spoiled barrels of wine stored too long in damp cellars? Or was it something stranger still? A poison that seeped into the very wood of the building, feeding on every glass poured by the fire. The incidents accumulated like stones in a riverbed, shaping the current of fear that carried the story forward. Each death, each sickness, each trembling survivor added to the weight of mystery. And as the years passed, the hotel's name was seldom spoken aloud, but its memory lingered. Travelers who knew the story shivered when they passed the town, their eyes avoiding the building that still stood silent, its windows like unblinking eyes. It is in these incidents, small in number but heavy in consequence, that we glimpse the fragility of trust, the danger hidden in ordinary gestures. The wine was not just a drink. It was a promise of safety, of fellowship, broken again and again in the quiet Oregon night. There was one incident that stood apart from the others, not for its violence, but for the weight of sorrow it carried. A family of 3, an itinerant carpenter, his wife, and their young daughter, arrived on a wet March evening. They had been on the road for days, their wagon heavy with tools and meager belongings. The innkeeper welcomed them as he did all others, pouring the familiar wine. The father accepted gladly, the mother hesitated but drank out of courtesy, and the daughter, only 12, was given a diluted glass to help her sleep. That night, the halls echoed with muffled coughing and the sound of footsteps rushing to the family's door. By morning, the carpenter was gone. His wife lay too weak to rise, and the child, pale but alive, clutched her mother's hand. The girl's survival was a miracle, or perhaps a cruel reminder of what had been lost. She would later tell neighbors that the wine had tasted like medicine, like something you shouldn't drink. The physician summoned from the nearby town recorded the case in his ledger. He noted the symptoms with clinical detachment: nausea, sweating, constricted pupils, paralysis of the chest. His diagnosis was inconclusive. Possible foodborne contamination, he wrote. But in the margin, as though uncertain whether to admit it, He added 2 words: suspected poison. That note, nearly lost to time, remains one of the few fragments of medical testimony from the era. It suggests that at least some observers recognized a deliberate pattern, though no one dared to voice it openly in the presence of the innkeeper. The local newspaper carried a short column weeks later. Buried between articles on wartime rationing and farm yields, it read, "Strange illness strikes guests of roadside hotel. Reports unverified. Authorities advise caution." The story was cautious, careful not to accuse, yet its tone carried unease. Readers whispered about it in church pews and general stores, and though no official inquiry followed, the words lingered. To print such a rumor was unusual. To do so during wartime, when unity was prized above suspicion, made it all the more remarkable. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere began to change. Guests who once filled the parlor with chatter now lowered their voices, casting nervous glances toward their glasses. Some declined the wine politely, claiming headaches or stomach troubles, though the innkeeper's smile never faltered. Yet most still drank, compelled by courtesy or habit, and many would later regret it. The hallways grew quieter as more rooms were vacated, not by travelers leaving at dawn, but by bodies carried away in wagons beneath sheets. The sound of doors closing at night took on a finality that chilled even the most hardened guests. By the summer of 1918, the pattern was undeniable. There were too many deaths, too many nights filled with fevered cries. Yet still nothing was done. The sheriff, overworked and under pressure from the war effort, dismissed the cases as illness. Neighbors looked away, unwilling to accuse a man who had lived among them for years. And travelers, desperate for shelter, continued to arrive, unaware of the whispers, unaware of the wine. The insidious part of the story was its restraint. There was no open violence, no weapon brandished in the firelight. Only the glass, the swallow, the silent betrayal of trust. Again and again, the pattern repeated itself until the very walls of the hotel seemed steeped in it. The place was not haunted by spirits, but by memory, by the knowledge that within those rooms, countless guests had surrendered to sleep and never awoken. And so, as the years passed, the list of incidents grew longer. A widow traveling alone, a group of soldiers on leave, a pair of merchants returning from Portland. Each carried their own hopes into the hotel, each accepted the hospitality of the glass, and each fell into the same grim silence. Their stories, scattered across diaries, letters, and whispered recollections, together form the dark mosaic we know today. The tale of the Oregon hotel where wine was poured with a smile, and where life was drained away with every sip. The first waves of response came not from officials, but from families. Letters sent home by travelers who survived described the strangeness of the wine, the weakness that followed, and the hushed atmosphere inside the hotel. Those who lost loved ones spoke of unanswered questions, of bodies returned without explanation. In a culture where family bonds carried enormous weight, grief was seldom silent. Mothers wept in church pews, fathers demanded answers at town meetings, and children were left to wonder why the last journey of their kin ended in that quiet wooden building by the roadside. Doctors, too, found themselves caught in the puzzle. Rural physicians worked with limited tools, stethoscopes, thermometers, crude microscopes, and leaned heavily on intuition. Many recognized the signs of poisoning: the burning throat, the fever, the rapid decline of bodily strength. Yet few dared to commit such suspicions to paper. To accuse an innkeeper without irrefutable proof risked not only legal repercussions but also social ostracism. And so medical men resorted to vague terms: gastrointestinal distress, sudden malady, cause uncertain. Their caution allowed the cycle to continue. A handful in private admitted their doubts. In diaries never intended for public eyes, some scribbled words like strychnine or arsenic, though they themselves could not be sure. Pastors interpreted the events through the lens of morality. In sermons, the wine became a metaphor, temptation disguised as comfort, sin concealed in the appearance of hospitality. Congregations listened with bowed heads, some recalling their own nights at the hotel, others shivering at the thought of neighbors lost there. Religion provided an explanation when science faltered. To the faithful, the poisoned glass was less a crime than a divine warning, a punishment for indulgence. These interpretations, though powerful, only deepened the mystery. for they diverted attention away from the human agent who might have been responsible. Neighbors and townsfolk lived in quiet contradiction. They knew the innkeeper. He was not a stranger, but a man they had greeted in shops, whose face had become part of their daily landscape. To accuse him outright was unthinkable. Instead, they turned inward, avoiding the hotel when possible, steering relatives to other lodgings, whispering warnings rather than raising alarms. In this silence lay complicity, a community that sensed the danger yet chose the safety of half-spoken rumor over confrontation. Fear kept them bound, fear of being wrong, fear of what might happen if they were right. The press captured the tension with characteristic ambiguity. Some newspapers reported strange illnesses with cautious language, always hedged with disclaimers, sources unverified, circumstances unclear. Others ignored the matter altogether, preferring stories that would not disturb wartime morale. Still, small-town editors could not resist a whiff of scandal. A column might appear describing the hotel as unlucky or hinting at a sickness tied to drink. Readers read between the lines, and the story spread, gaining momentum not through headlines but through gossip, carried from one town to another by travelers who had heard the tale secondhand. Psychology, though still in its early years as a formal discipline, offered another perspective. Scholars of the time debated suggestion and hysteria, the way fear itself could make bodies weak. Could it be that some fell ill not from poison, but from expectation, from the whispered warnings that primed their minds? The line between physical and psychological affliction was blurred in 1917. A traveler who heard rumors of tainted wine might drink with dread already seated in his stomach, and dread alone could summon symptoms that mimicked illness. Yet such explanations, while intriguing, could not account for the bodies buried, the children left fatherless. There were also those who dismissed the entire affair. Skeptics argued that rural life was always touched by sickness, that influenza and spoiled food claimed lives everywhere. To them, the stories of poisoned wine were nothing more than superstition layered over coincidence. This skeptical view, though plausible, failed to satisfy those who had seen the pattern too clearly. 1 or 2 deaths might be chance. A dozen over months, always after the ritual of drinking, suggested something more. Thus, the reactions of society formed a fractured picture. Families demanded answers but received none. Doctors recognized the signs yet cloaked them in vagueness. Pastors turned tragedy into allegory, neighbors into silence, newspapers into rumor. The result was paralysis, a community caught between belief and denial, between the need to protect its own and the fear of exposing an unspeakable truth. And in this paralysis, the hotel endured. Guests continued to arrive, the innkeeper continued to pour, and the cycle repeated. The reactions of society, instead of halting the pattern, became the soil in which it grew. Distrust, fear, morality, skepticism, all tangled together, leaving behind a story not of resolution, but of quiet complicity. The night that would be remembered as the darkest of them all began without distinction. It was late autumn, the Oregon air wet and heavy with mist, and the hotel glowed softly against the blackened fields that surrounded it. Lamps burned low in the lobby, their halos weak but steady, and the fire in the hearth snapped and spat as it always had. The innkeeper stood behind the counter, ledger open, his mustache carefully groomed, his manner calm. To any passerby, it was an ordinary evening at a roadside hotel. But inside, the air carried a tension that the guests could not name. A group of 5 travelers had arrived together. 2 lumbermen heading south, a nurse traveling east, and a pair of brothers bound for Portland. They were weary, damp from the road, and grateful for shelter. The innkeeper greeted them warmly, as always, and with practiced grace, he reached beneath the counter for the bottle. The cork came free with a soft sigh, and the glasses were set in a neat row. The wine poured dark and red, glimmering in the lamplight. Each guest took their glass, raising it almost automatically. The ritual was so familiar, so expected, that to refuse would have been unthinkable. They drank, the liquid warm on their tongues, and the innkeeper watched, his expression unreadable. At first, the evening unfolded as usual. Boots dried by the fire, stories were traded. The nurse spoke of her patients with quiet authority, while the lumbermen laughed at the brothers' attempts to sing an old tune. Yet beneath the laughter there was a growing unease, subtle but undeniable. The nurse set down her glass early, pressing her hand to her chest. One of the lumbermen stopped mid-laugh, his face paling, his body stiffening as though gripped by an unseen hand. Then it began in earnest. Chairs scraped back, the firelight flickered across faces twisted in pain. One man fell to his knees, clutching his stomach, retching violently onto the wooden floor. Another staggered toward the staircase, his hand clawing at the railing before he collapsed halfway up the steps. The nurse, trembling, tried to speak, tried to give instructions, but her words faltered as her throat burned, her body convulsing in spasms. The brothers clung to each other, their cries echoing down the hallway, one collapsing against the other until both lay silent in the flickering light. The innkeeper did not move to help. He stood by the counter, his eyes fixed on the chaos as if detached, as if observing some experiment whose outcome he already knew. The surviving guests, those who had drunk less, who had hesitated, stumbled in panic. A woman screamed from the upper floor as the sound of choking carried through the walls. The air grew thick with the stench of vomit, sweat, and kerosene. The quiet hotel transformed into a chamber of suffering. Outside, the Oregon night pressed close, muffling the cries, carrying them no farther than the trees that loomed in silence. Wagons rattled distantly on unseen roads, unaware of the horror playing out within the wooden walls. Time seemed to slow, the ticking of the clock in the lobby marking each agonizing second as if mocking the dying. The climax of terror came when the nurse, still conscious despite her failing body, crawled across the floor toward the door. Her hand left a smear of blood on the wood as she reached for the handle, her eyes wide with desperation. She managed to pull it open just enough for the cold night air to spill inside before her body gave way. The door swung ajar, and for a moment the sound of the storm outside mingled with the gasps and cries within. Some said that in that instant, the innkeeper finally spoke. His words were low, calm, almost inaudible above the chaos. What he said remains uncertain. Different accounts record different phrases. Some claimed he muttered a prayer, others that he whispered an apology, and still others that he simply said, "It is done." Whatever the truth, the words carried no comfort. They were the punctuation to a night of calculated betrayal. When dawn broke, the hotel was silent. The fire had burned to embers, the lamps guttered out, bodies lay where they had fallen, on the staircase, by the hearth, near the door that still hung slightly open. Survivors, those who had drunk little or not at all, sat in stunned silence, their eyes hollow, their minds unable to grasp what had unfolded. The sheriff would arrive hours later, summoned by frantic messengers from nearby farms. He found the innkeeper seated behind the counter, calm, as though waiting. The sheriff's notes, fragmentary and inconsistent, described the scene in blunt terms. Multiple deceased. Cause unknown, innkeeper questioned. Yet no trial followed, no conviction. Whether through lack of evidence, wartime distraction, or quiet influence, the matter dissolved into rumor. The hotel remained standing, its doors still open, though its name would forever be stained. For the survivors, that night became the defining moment of their lives. They carried the memory like a brand, speaking of it only in hushed tones often decades later, their voices trembling as they recalled the taste of the wine, the sound of choking in the firelit room, the sight of the innkeeper's stillness amid the horror. It was a climax not only of suffering but of silence, for the truth of what happened in that Oregon hotel was never resolved. The night ended, but its shadow stretched on, long and cold. Years after the night of poisoned wine, the hotel still stood. Its wooden beams weathered gray, its roof patched and sagging, it no longer held the soft glow of lanterns or the warmth of a hearth. Travelers passed it by, wagons creaking along the road without pause. Horses quickened their pace when drawing near, as though they too sensed that the walls retained a memory best avoided. For the families of those who died, grief became a quiet inheritance. Some never spoke of it, choosing silence over the pain of retelling. Others clung to fragments of detail, repeating them until memory blurred into ritual. The smell of wine, the sound of coughing, the half-open door. Children grew up hearing whispers of how their uncle, or their mother, or their brother never returned from that Oregon inn. In time, those whispers hardened into legend, and the line between history and story thinned. The community surrounding the hotel never agreed on what truly happened. Local newspapers carried headlines at the time, some careful, some sensational. One paper insisted it had been a case of spoiled drink, a tragic accident of bad preservation. Another hinted at a deliberate act, suggesting that the innkeeper had grown weary of strangers or harbored secret grievances. But as months passed, and then years, no conclusive evidence appeared. Testimonies contradicted each other. Survivors remembered the same moments differently, their fear distorting the details. Doctors of the period offered explanations shaped by the science of their day. Some suspected contaminated casks, poisoned by molds or metals from the storage vessels. Others believed in a chemical corruption introduced by transport, perhaps from barrels once used for industrial substances. These were reasonable theories, yet none aligned neatly with the sheer violence of the symptoms described. The convulsions, the sudden paralysis, the swift decline, these details hinted at something stronger than mere spoilage. But without modern tools, their analysis could go no further. Pastors framed the incident in spiritual terms. To some, it was divine punishment, a warning against indulgence and excess. To others, it was a test of faith, a shadow cast by human cruelty and the absence of moral restraint. Sermons lingered on the image of the poisoned cup, drawing from biblical echoes of betrayal and sacrifice. Congregations sat in uneasy silence as the parallels were drawn, unsure if they were being comforted or condemned. The innkeeper himself became a figure of speculation. Those who claimed to have seen him that night described his composure in the face of chaos, his stillness as others screamed and fell. Some said he had been arrested and then quietly released, protected by connections or by the confusion of a nation preoccupied with war. Others swore he disappeared altogether, vanishing one dawn and never seen again. His name remained on the hotel's ledger, written in neat script, but whether his hand ever touched it again was never proved. In the decades that followed, the abandoned building attracted its own kind of visitor. Curious travelers, daring youths, and amateur historians ventured inside. They found dust, broken chairs, cracked glass, and the lingering smell of damp wood. Some claimed to hear faint coughing in the night air, as though the walls themselves still echoed the agony. Others swore they found stains darkened into the floorboards, marks that no scrubbing could erase. Each tale fed the reputation of the place, turning it from tragedy into folklore. By the mid-20th century, the story of the poisoned wine had become part of Oregon's darker cultural memory. Writers and folklorists gathered accounts, piecing them together into narratives that blurred fact with myth. Some portrayed the innkeeper as a deranged recluse. Others cast him as a victim of circumstance, scapegoated for forces beyond his control. In both versions, the truth slipped further away, replaced by the stories people needed more than the facts themselves. Even today, questions linger. Could the wine have been laced deliberately with arsenic or strychnine, both known poisons of the era and tragically easy to obtain? Was it truly possible that such a substance might have slipped unnoticed into a cask, only to unleash its fury when poured into fragile human bodies? Or was it something subtler, a convergence of bad storage, poor preservation, and chance that produced symptoms so violent they seemed intentional? We cannot know. The hotel has long since crumbled, its timbers collapsed, its foundation overtaken by grass and moss. Where once voices rose in laughter or fell in terror, there is now only wind moving through the trees. Yet the story endures, carried in local lore, whispered by those who still recall the warnings of their grandparents. The poisoned wine of 1917 remains unsolved. It is a tale not only of death, but of ambiguity, a reminder of how quickly certainty slips away when fear takes hold. In the absence of clear answers, people shape the memory to fit their fears, their faith, and their imagination. Perhaps that is what makes the story endure, not the facts themselves, but the mystery that surrounds them. And so the hotel in Oregon lingers in memory like an aftertaste that will not fade. It asks quiet questions with no reply. What truly happened in those rooms? Who was responsible? And why does silence feel heavier than confession? As the years stretch on, the answers retreat further into the shadows, leaving only the echo of glasses raised, the faint trace of poisoned wine, and the weight of stories that refuse to die.